Termination letter was already sitting in a manila envelope on the hospital administrator's desk when Owen Larke walked out of Mercy General for the last time, carrying nothing but his worn canvas jacket and a small paper bag his 8-year-old son had packed for him that morning. 2 granola bars, a juice box, and a handwritten note that said, "Dad, I hope work is nice to you today." It wasn't. Owen had spent 11 years as a critical care nurse in one of the busiest trauma centers in Cincinnati. He was the kind of nurse that other nurses called when something went wrong at 3 a.m. and the attending physician was unreachable. He could read a patient's vitals and know, not guess, know, that something was about to shift before the monitors screamed it. Colleagues half-joked that he had a sixth sense. Patients' families hugged him in hallways and cried on his shoulder and sent him Christmas cards for years afterward. And yet, when he handed in his badge at the front security desk on a gray Tuesday morning in February, the woman behind the counter simply said, "I'll need your parking pass, too." Nobody asked why he was leaving. Nobody had ever really asked about Owen at all. He had been invisible for years in the way that truly essential people often are. So reliably present, so quietly competent, that everyone assumed he would simply always be there. Management scheduled him for overnight shifts, 6, sometimes 7 times a month. Charge nurses pulled him into emergencies that weren't his assignment. When a new protocol needed testing, Owen's floor got it first because Owen would figure it out and nobody would have to explain it twice. He never complained. He never escalated. He absorbed everything the hospital threw at him with the same steady calm he brought to a patient coding at midnight. What the hospital didn't see, what it never thought to look for, was what that steadiness cost him. His wife, Renata, had died 22 months earlier from a brain aneurysm. No warning, no slow decline. She was fine on a Thursday and gone by Saturday morning, and Owen had driven home from the hospital where she'd been treated, not Mercy General. He could not have survived that, and found their son, Mason, asleep on the couch still wearing his school clothes, waiting for news that Owen had been destroyed to deliver over the phone. After that, everything became arithmetic. How many hours of sleep could he get if he left the hospital by 7 and Mason's school started at 8:15? Whether he could make the $40 copay for Mason's asthma prescription and still cover the electric bill. How many nights in a row a child could eat macaroni and cheese before it stopped being comfort food and started being a problem. Owen ran the numbers constantly, behind his eyes, even while he was drawing blood or adjusting a drip line or telling a family their father had made it through the night. He asked for a schedule adjustment 8 months after Renata died. Nothing dramatic, just a reduction in overnight shifts, maybe 1 or 2 fewer per month, so he could be home more consistently when Mason woke up from the nightmares that had started after the funeral. His supervisor, a pinched and efficient man named Dale, had listened with the expression of someone waiting for a sales pitch to end. Then Dale had told him that the unit was short-staffed and everyone was sacrificing, and perhaps Owen should consider whether critical care was still the right environment for his lifestyle. His lifestyle. As though grief were a hobby. Owen filed the request in writing anyway. It was denied twice. The third time he didn't bother filing it. The night he made his decision, Mason had come into the kitchen at 11:30 to find his father sitting at the table with a stack of bills in one hand and a cold cup of coffee in the other. The boy stood in the doorway in his dinosaur pajamas, squinting against the light. "Dad," Mason said, "do you ever sleep?" Owen looked at his son. The dark circles under his own eyes reflected back in miniature, the slight hunch of a child who had learned not to need too much, and felt something give way quietly inside his chest. "Go back to bed, buddy," he said. "You should too," Mason said, and then, with the devastating pragmatism of an 8-year-old who had already lost one parent, "You're the only one we have." Owen resigned the following morning. He spent the first 2 weeks doing things he hadn't done in years. He drove Mason to school and stood at the gate long enough to watch the boy actually walk inside instead of peeling away from the curb before the bell. He cooked real meals, nothing elaborate, but actual vegetables, actual protein, food that required a cutting board. He slept past 6 a.m., twice, which felt so disorienting he lay there both times convinced he'd forgotten something critical. Slowly, that feeling faded. Mason started leaving his bedroom door open again at night. Small thing. Owen noticed. Meanwhile, back at Mercy General, things were not going smoothly. The hospital's director of operations was a woman named Sylvia Holt. 41 years old, Stanford MBA, recruited from a health system in Boston where she had cut costs by 22% in 3 years and been celebrated for it. She arrived in Cincinnati with a reputation for precision and a manner that the nursing staff described, in break rooms and parking garages, as efficient the way a scalpel is efficient. It doesn't care what it cuts through. Sylvia had been at Mercy General for 14 months. In that time, she had restructured 2 departments, eliminated a hospitalist position that she considered redundant, introduced a new electronic documentation system that added 40 minutes to every nurse's shift, and earned exactly 0 friends among clinical staff. She was not unaware of this. She simply did not consider it relevant. Results were relevant. Relationships were variables. She had barely registered Owen Larke's resignation. Dale had mentioned it in a weekly ops summary. She'd flagged it as a staffing gap to fill and moved on. Then March happened. A respiratory illness swept through the pediatric and geriatric floors simultaneously. Not unusual for late winter, but the volume was punishing. Staff called in sick. Traveling nurses canceled contracts. The electronic documentation system, which Owen had been quietly compensating for with workarounds he'd never been asked to share because no one had ever asked, began producing errors that cascaded across patient records in ways the IT vendor could not immediately explain or fix. 2 medication errors occurred in 72 hours, nothing fatal, but close enough that the hospital's legal team got involved and the state health board sent a notice, and Sylvia sat in her office at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night, staring at an incident report that made her feel, for the first time in her professional life, genuinely out of her depth. She asked Dale, who had managed the documentation transition on the floor where both errors occurred. Dale paused. "That would have been Owen Larke's unit. Get him back," she said. "He quit," Dale said. "I know he quit. Get him back anyway." There were 2 days of phone calls that Owen did not return. A formal letter from HR that he read once and set face down on the kitchen counter. An email from Dale that said the hospital would like to discuss re-engagement opportunities, which was the kind of language that made Owen tired in a very specific way. He was at the public library with Mason on a Saturday afternoon. Mason doing a school project on the water cycle. Owen pretending to read a magazine while actually watching his son underline things with a yellow highlighter with enormous seriousness. When someone sat down in the chair across from him, he looked up. Sylvia Holt was not in her usual uniform of tailored blazer and controlled expression. She was in a dark green jacket, jeans, her hair pulled back simply, and she looked like a person who had driven somewhere without entirely planning what to say when she arrived. "Mr. Larke," she said, "I'm sorry to intrude." Owen looked at her for a moment. "How did you find me here?" "Your emergency contact form listed this branch as your son's preferred library." She paused. "I realize that sounds more alarming than I intended." Mason looked up from his project, assessed the situation with the frank curiosity of a 3rd grader, and said, "Do you know my dad from work?" "I do," Sylvia said. "He doesn't work there anymore," Mason said helpfully, and went back to his highlighter. Sylvia turned back to Owen. She explained the situation at the hospital without flinching from the details. The errors, the board notice, the documentation failures, the fact that 3 nurses had told her separately in the past week that Owen had maintained a manual backup system for the electronic records that no one had known about and that would have prevented both incidents. She told him she needed him back, at least temporarily, to stabilize the unit. Owen listened. He had the same steady quality in this conversation that he had in every difficult conversation. Not coldness, not detachment, but a kind of patient attention that made people feel heard even when the answer they were about to receive was not what they wanted. "No," he said. She had not expected that. She covered it well, but she hadn't. "I can authorize a temporary pay increase," she said. "Significant. And I'll speak to Dale about the scheduling situation." "The scheduling situation," Owen repeated quietly. "The overnight shift frequency. I reviewed the logs. You were running at nearly double the recommended rotation for a single employee. That shouldn't have happened." "I requested an adjustment for 8 months," Owen said, in writing. 3 times. Sylvia didn't look away. "I know. Those requests came to your office." "I know," she said again. The silence held. Mason had set down his highlighter and was watching them both now with the focused attention of someone following a conversation in a language he was still learning. "I finally sleep," Owen said. "My son talks to me at dinner. Last week he told me about a kid at school who can burp the alphabet, and I laughed until my eyes watered, and I haven't laughed like that in 2 years." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not trading that back," Sylvia nodded slowly. She did not push. She said she understood, gave him a business card he didn't ask for, and left. Owen watched her go. Mason picked his highlighter back up. "She seems sad," Mason said. "She seemed like she has a lot of problems," Owen said. "Same thing sometimes," said Mason, and underlined something about the water cycle. Owen thought about that on the drive home. He was still thinking about it 3 days later when he drove past Mercy General on his way to a grocery store and sat in traffic for 4 minutes, staring at the building he had given 11 years of his life to. He thought about the patients on that floor, the ones he knew by name, the elderly man with congestive heart failure who had been there 6 weeks and called Owen's son. The teenager recovering from a car accident who had asked Owen once at 2 in the morning if it ever got less scary, and Owen had told her honestly that it got more familiar, which wasn't the same thing but was sometimes enough. He did not go back that day. But he started thinking about what going back would require, not if, what it would require. There was a difference, and Owen had always been precise about language. Sylvia, for her part, was doing something she had not done in a long time. She was sitting with discomfort instead of solving it. She had grown up the daughter of a man who believed that sentiment was self-indulgence. Her father had been a surgeon, technically brilliant, emotionally sealed, the kind of man who considered taking a sick day a character flaw. Sylvia had inherited his work ethic and his armor in equal measure. She had built her career on being the person who did not hesitate, did not waver, did not need. It had worked. By every measurable standard, it had worked. But she stood in her apartment that Sunday evening. A very clean, very quiet apartment, with expensive furniture and no photographs on the refrigerator, and thought about a man in a public library who had laughed until his eyes watered at a story about a kid who could burp the alphabet, and she felt the particular hollowness of someone who has optimized everything and wondered why it feels like nothing. She called Owen the following Tuesday, not to negotiate. She said that up front. "I'm not calling to offer you anything," she said. "I wanted to apologize for the scheduling requests. They should have been approved. The system failed you, and I was in charge of the system." Owen was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "That's it. What else would you like me to say?" She almost laughed. She couldn't remember the last time she'd almost laughed at something that wasn't a prepared joke. "I don't know," she admitted. They talked for 40 minutes. Owen was not warm exactly, but he was honest in a way Sylvia was not accustomed to from people who reported, however indirectly, to her. He told her what the floor had been like the last year he was there, the things that didn't work, the things that did. He was not bitter, which surprised her. He spoke about the hospital like someone who had genuinely loved the work and been ground down by the systems around it. The patients were never the problem, he said. The patients were the whole point. She told him she'd been trying to implement a new staffing model and kept hitting resistance from the nursing union's liaison and didn't understand why. Owen explained it in 4 sentences. She was quiet for a long moment. "How do I fix it?" she said. "You don't," he said. "You listen to it. There's a difference." After they hung up, Sylvia sat in her office and looked at the staffing reports she'd been wrestling with for 2 months. Then she did something she had never done in 14 months at this hospital. She walked down to the nurses' break room on the 2nd floor, poured herself a cup of the terrible coffee, and sat down. The nurses who filtered in and out of that break room over the next 45 minutes were, at first, visibly confused, then cautious, then slowly 1 or 2 of them, honest. A travel nurse named Petra told her the documentation system had added so much charting time that she'd cried in her cart twice this month. An LPN named Jerome said he'd stopped reporting near misses because the paperwork made it not worth the effort, which he knew was the wrong call. But what were you going to do? Sylvia wrote nothing down. She just listened. She went back the next day. And the day after, Owen heard about it from a former colleague who texted him a photo of Sylvia sitting at the break room table with a foam cup of coffee, looking less like a hospital director and more like someone trying to learn something. He looked at the photo for a long time. Mason wandered into the kitchen. "What are you looking at?" A picture of someone changing, Owen said, and then wasn't entirely sure if that was what he was seeing or what he hoped he was seeing. Sylvia called again a week later. This time she had a specific proposal and she was direct about it. "I want you to come back as a patient care consultant," she said. "Not a nurse, or not only a nurse. I want you to help me understand what's broken before we break anything else. Part-time. Your schedule. You'd have direct access to me, not to Dale. And I will be implementing the scheduling adjustment policy before you set foot back in that building." Owen said he needed to think about it. He talked to Mason that night, which was something he had started doing, not burdening the boy but not pretending the boy wasn't perceptive enough to be included. He told him there might be a chance to go back to the hospital in a different way, in a way that might actually let him fix some things. Mason ate a spoonful of soup. "Would you still be home for dinner?" "Yes." "Would you still do Tuesday nights?" Tuesday nights were when they watched nature documentaries and Owen let Mason eat on the couch, which was a rule they'd invented together. "Yes." Mason nodded. "Then I think you should go back," he said. "Because you miss the patients. I can tell." Owen looked at his son for a long moment. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart," Mason said. "You were just working too much to notice." The morning Owen walked back into Mercy General, he did not go in through the main entrance. He went through the side door he'd always used, the one near the parking structure that opened directly into the staff corridor. A few nurses saw him and stopped. One of them, a woman named Charlene who'd worked the overnight shift beside Owen for 6 years, put her hands on her hips and said, "It's about time." Owen smiled. "Good to see you too, Charlene." The work was different than it had been, harder in some ways because fixing systems required a different patience than fixing people. But Owen discovered he was good at it in the same way he'd been good at nursing. Not because it came easily, but because he cared enough to stay with the hard parts. He sat in meetings he would have found pointless 6 months ago and now understood were where the real decisions were made. He advocated for things bluntly enough that Sylvia occasionally had to intervene, which led to arguments between them that were productive in ways neither of them had entirely expected. They disagreed about things, specific, concrete things. Budget allocation, overtime caps, how to handle a difficult physician who'd been coasting on tenure for a decade. Sylvia was used to having the final word. Owen was used to saying what he actually thought. They met somewhere in the uncomfortable middle and, more often than not, the result was better than what either of them would have done alone. He ran into her in the hospital parking garage one evening in early May. She was sitting on the hood of her car in the nearly empty structure, still in her work clothes, looking at her phone but not really seeing it. Owen slowed. "You okay?" She looked up. "I got a call today from the Boston system. My old hospital. They offered me a VP role, regional oversight." She said it flatly, like she was reading from a document. Owen leaned against the concrete pillar. And I told them I'd think about it." She paused. "My father would have said it was the obvious choice. Clear advancement, more visibility, more leverage. What do you say?" She looked at him with the expression of someone who is not used to being asked that. "I say I've spent the last 2 months actually understanding something for the first time, and I'm not sure I want to leave before I find out what that means." Owen said nothing. He was not a man who filled silences that didn't need filling. "I also," she said, and stopped. "You also," he repeated quietly. She looked at the middle distance for a moment. "I don't want to leave," she said. "And I'm trying to figure out how much of that is about the work and how much of it is about—" She stopped again. A car drove past somewhere below them. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly. "You can say it," Owen said. "I'm not sure I know how," she said. And it cost her something to say it, he could tell. He pushed off the pillar. "Mason's got a school thing Thursday. A science fair." He paused. "He's been talking about you. Wants to know if you'll come." Sylvia looked at him. "He's been talking about me?" "He says you ask good questions when you visit the floor. He came with me last week, you remember. You asked him what he thought the hardest part of being a nurse was." Owen smiled slightly. "He said the sad parts. You told him that was a better answer than most adults would give." She was quiet for a moment. "It was. He's been thinking about it ever since," Owen said. The conversation, I mean. He thinks about things for a long time and then says them when you've forgotten you had the conversation. He sounds like you, she said softly. He sounds like his mother, Owen said. Not with grief this time. With something that had moved past grief into something steadier. She would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for people who pretended to be smaller than they were. Sylvia didn't speak. But she didn't look away either. Thursday, Owen said. 6 o'clock. He's doing a model of the water cycle. He let that sit. He actually knows a lot about it. He walked to his car. She watched him go. She came on Thursday. Mason, who had built a remarkably detailed model using a plastic container, a heat lamp, and what appeared to be an entire bag of cotton balls, explained the entire cycle to her with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for a specific audience. Sylvia asked 3 questions. They were the right 3 questions. Mason beamed. On the drive home, Owen and Sylvia stood in the school parking lot for a moment while Mason ran back inside because he'd forgotten his poster. The evening was cold and clear, the kind of mid-May cold that reminds you winter didn't leave as cleanly as you thought. He's extraordinary, Sylvia said. I know, Owen said. You should be proud. Every day, he said. He hesitated. I wanted to say something. She waited. When you came to the library, he said. The way you sat down across from me and said you were sorry to intrude, you look like someone who'd driven somewhere without knowing why. And I've thought about that a lot, because I think you knew why. I think you've known for a while. She held his gaze. I declined the Boston offer, she said. This morning? Owen nodded once. Something in him settled, the way things settle when they have been uncertain for a long time and finally find their answer. Okay, he said. She almost said something formal. She caught it. Okay, she said instead. Mason burst back out through the school's double doors clutching his poster, running slightly sideways the way he always did when he was carrying something awkward. He skidded to a stop between them and looked up. Are we going to get ice cream? He said. Owen looked at Sylvia. Sylvia looked at Owen. Obviously, she said. They walked to the car, Mason in the middle swinging his poster, talking about condensation with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered something true about the world and could not believe everyone didn't know about it yet. The night was cold, and the street lights were coming on, and there was nothing remarkable about any of it except that Owen Larke, for the first time since a gray Saturday morning 22 months ago, did not feel like a man carrying something alone. And somewhere in the story of how that happened, the resignation, the library, the parking garage, the terrible break room coffee, the 3 questions about the water cycle, there is something that doesn't fit neatly into a lesson or a formula, but that most people recognize when they see it. Some things are not fixed by systems. Some things are fixed by one person being honest with another in an empty parking garage at the end of a long day. If you've ever had to choose between showing up for your work and showing up for your life, leave a comment. Tell us what you chose. And if this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs to hear that getting out doesn't always mean giving up. Sometimes it means making room for something better to find you.